OODAcast, informing your decisions with intelligence, analysis, and insight. Brought to you by the team at OODAloop.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Bob Gorley. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of OODA LLC, and I want to start today's webinar with a couple admin announcements. One, we have enabled the Q&A function on Zoom, and by now you all know how to use that. You just click on Q&A and type any questions you have. We've turned on the feature that will let you see other people's questions, and you can upvote, and we'll be watching that through this webinar as we get into this. And another thing I would like to say is that the chat function is on, and we are recording this session. And the thought is this is so other members can watch this. At some point, we may also open it up to others who are interested, and we'll post that on YouTube. About the topic, as you know, you're here because we're talking about the geopolitical and business impacts of the Matamoros kidnappings and other issues along the U.S.-Mexico border. In order to discuss this and related issues, we have pulled together an expert panel of people who really understand this issue. It can help bring sense to it, including good friend of the OODA network, John Sullivan, who you all know, and I think for most of you probably needs no introduction. But let me tell you this about John. He has been a professional in law enforcement for an entire career and is also extremely highly published and highly regarded on topics such as international crime, international terrorism, and advanced weapons of mass destruction that we all ought to be very wary of. And John, with that, I'd really appreciate it if you introduce the topic and our two panelists. And as you do that, I'll fade into the background here.
Great. Thank you, Bob. First, I'd like to thank you for inviting us to do this. This is a critically important issue for the United States, Mexico, and indeed beyond, since we're really talking about how criminal armed groups and transnational organized crime challenge nation states. In a lot of ways, we're talking about how networks challenge nation states, and that's a discussion which is much longer than we can cover today. Over the past year, especially in recent months, the rhetoric calling for U.S. military intervention in Mexico has increased. This rhetoric ranges from calls for bombing cartel bases to more restrained calls for U.S. military intervention in response to the fentanyl crisis, as well as the call to designate cartels as foreign terrorist groups. We'll talk about that a bit more. That's not new. It has been a perennial suggestion over the past decade or so. In the aftermath of the recent kidnapping murder in Matamoros, the calls for U.S. intervention have reached a crescendo. The calls largely originate on the extreme versions, largely originate on the ultra-right, and have raised concerns of uninvited incursions into Mexico, reminiscent of the punitive expedition. U.S. Army was a formal name. The informal name is the Pancho Villa expedition. It was led by Brigadier General John Pershing, who later became quite notable in World War I, with the concurrence of Major General Frederick Funston. And that expedition ranged from 14 March 1916 through 7 February 1917. Mexican political elites among all four major parties find the calls for what they see as a renewed punitive expedition highly offensive. I've been on the call with several members of the Chamber of Deputies over the past week, trying to calm the tenure and other members of the Mexican national security community as well. This panel is going to discuss the details of this cartel assault and place it in context. First, I want to introduce the panel. Myself, I'm John Sullivan. Bob mentioned who I was briefly. I've been working with the OODA Loop since its inception. Prior to that, I worked with its predecessor, the Terrorism Research Center. I spent over 30 years with the LA County Sheriff's Department, the bulk of that in counterterrorism intelligence, and got my PhD looking at the impact of Mexican drug cartels on sovereignty about 10 years ago. So is where I got my PhD. I've been actually studying it longer. On the panel, we have two of my long-term time colleagues. Lieutenant Hal Kempfer, who's a retired Marine Corps Reserve officer. He has a deep bench of experience working on border security issues and with high intensity drug trafficking areas, particularly in the LA Haida, and Brian Michael Jenkins, who I personally believe is not only a personal mentor and a great long-term friend, but one of the premier counterterrorism experts in the country. I put him and beyond in the world. He's one of the top 5 terrorist scholars that I know, and I'm fortunate to have interacted with him greatly over the past, must be going on 35 years, which is kind of interesting in its own note. Before I ask them to give them some brief self-introductions to put their expertise into better context, I want to briefly outline the agenda. Hal's going to discuss the background of the attack. That'll be followed by Brian looking at, are these terrorists or something else? And hopefully he'll be able to shed some insight into the background on the punitive expedition. I will then come back in, provide a little background on the Gulf Cartel, or the CDG, as we call it, especially the Scorpions or Los Scorpions faction that has been linked to this event. I think the fragmentation of cartel organizations in Mexico has been an ongoing issue that tends to drive violence, and I think, or exacerbate the underlying violence in contested plazas. I think this is a good case there. Then I will discuss criminal insurgency, a little bit on the hyper border economy and problems with the terrorist designation. From here, Hal, weigh in just briefly, introduce yourself, and then we'll come on and pass it on to Brian.
Okay, Hal Kempfer, retired Marine Corps intelligence officer. I was a lieutenant colonel and veteran of the Cold War, the war on drugs, the war on terror, Iraqi freedom, and Desert Storm, to kind of give a background. A lot of working civil military, worked under a program, worked with U.S. Northern Command for years doing civil military integration. But going back before that, I ran an intelligence center under Defense Intelligence Agency, where we worked a thing called consequence management, which was all really focused on civil military interface. And then before that, some years after Desert Storm, I got involved in the war on drugs and worked with a joint task force we had that worked across the southwest border, dealing with not just border operational issues in terms of surveillance and other things that we provide support, but also working closely with DEA, FBI, a variety of agencies, state and locals, going after the drug cartels, essentially tearing them apart, doing intense intelligence deep dives, supporting investigations, a variety of things to take down these large things like the Sinaloa Cowboys. That takes all of us back a few years. But that's what I did for a number of years. And I worked in the area of terrorism, homeland security, a little bit in the competitive intelligence with business world since. And that's kind of my background on this. And I appear on television a lot, but as John has mentioned many times, he thinks I truly have a face for radio. So anyway, that's me. All right.
Brian.
Brian, I think you hit mute.
It's a generational thing. Machines. Anyway, look, I really began Rand's research program on terrorism in 1972. It's more than 50 years ago. I tell people, give me another 50 years, I'll have it all sorted out. Really, what I'm more interested in this particular discussion we're going to have today, I went back to look it up, is actually 60 years ago. I'm 107 years old, by the way. 60 years ago, I wrote my thesis, which was titled "The Border War," and it was examination of U.S.-Mexico relations on the border during the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920. And I do want to say, John is right in terms of looking back at some of this. It's a history that has a relevance, mainly a cautionary example, so that as we talk about the possibilities of some type of use of military force in Mexico, there are some lessons to be learned from the intervention that took place and even the situation on the border before them. But I'll come back to that when we talk.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Hal, everything that supports a decision requires starting with a sit rep. And as an intel officer, I know you can give a brief to the staff on what actually happened in Matamoros. What do we know? What is the ground truth? And what is hyperbole?
Well, to get away from a lot of the hyperbole, what we do know is that 4 Americans went down to Matamoros. Ostensibly, one of them was to get cosmetic surgery, what's reportedly a tummy tuck. There were 3 men, 1 woman, and they drove down there and they went south of the border. Now, there was 5 total. Interestingly, some of the tightening up on the border thing that we've done over the last couple of decades prevented the 5th person from joining them because she didn't have the proper ID to get across the border. So they went down there and they drove right into the middle of pardon the expression, a street fight, that's the background. And that's part of the whole thing with Matamoros, is just the sheer amount of violence, street fights, crime that's on the border. And they got in the middle of it. Ostensibly, at first, they said they're African-American individuals. They thought maybe they were from Haiti or representing a Haitian gang. That came out. That's still unclear if that's actually valid or something that just was thrown out there. It's not really clear how the validity of that, but they were kidnapped, which, as Brian will tell you, Brian may be the foremost expert in the world on that type of kidnapping. And he will tell you that that is a lucrative trade, and they were kidnapped. Well, 2 of the men were killed. The woman was actually relatively unharmed, who was going down there for the surgery. Her name is Tay McGee. And then a guy named Eric Williams he also survived, but he was severely wounded, shot in the leg 3 times, which sounds a lot like torture. And it may be that the other 2 that were killed, they may too have been tortured, trying to get information out of them. Anyway, they were rescued very quickly, I might add, which was kind of interesting, by law enforcement authorities. And again, I will let John talk about the corruption factor that we deal with. And maybe they knew exactly where they were because, well, frankly, very possible some work for the same organization. But they were rescued. They're back in the U.S. The remains of the 2 others are being, I don't know if they're in the U.S. now or they're being moved to the U.S. There's going to be a separate autopsy done in the U.S. by their families. Interestingly, yesterday, of course, you may have seen the news that 5 individuals were found having been beaten severely with T-shirts over their heads, hands tied, outside of a car that had a handwritten note in the window from the Scorpion group of the Gulf Cartel with a really, "I'm sorry," and saying that they're sorry for this. These individuals did this without authorization. And it was an interesting note. Most experts have said they think it's a genuine note. They also doubt any sincerity in that note. But I think what they've done is they've realized they've created such a mess politically that they're trying to do something to overcome this. But that's kind of that's the bare bones of what's going on. And we can talk, John, I think we'll talk about more about the Gulf Cartel and the different groups or factions under a little bit later.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. We'll talk a little bit about what some of the Mexican political reaction is on that. But I think after the sit rep, it's important to put this all into historical context, go back to Brian's expertise in this area. And briefly, I'd ask Brian, after he talks about the punitive expedition and the issues, briefly talk about the issue of designating these groups as terrorists or not. And after that, Hal will weigh in on that, as will I. But I think those are the important to setting the discussion. Brian?
Okay, two things quickly. I mean, first of all, Held started off with a sit rep. Let me give you another sit rep. And it's that really the kind of lawlessness, the gunfights that we see in Matamoros and other towns on or near the border. That has gone way beyond local crime waves. We've seen a dramatic increase in violent crime, not simply by lone gunmen, but by heavily armed gangs. Kidnappings and homicides are way up, not just murders, but in some parts of the country, even beheadings. Police are getting into shootouts where they are frequently outgunned. It is starting to look like a violent terrorist campaign. Economic activity has been seriously declined. People are frightened. Everybody seems to be carrying a weapon, shooting on suspicion. Disturbing reports of summary executions, torture. Central government authority no longer exists in the Mexican states along the US border. Warlords are commanding their own armies, gunning down their rivals. The government in Mexico City cannot or will not bring the situation under control. With this kind of a challenge, the US government faces really has reason to fear unrest on its own territory. And as a consequence, has already deployed more than half of the mobile forces of the US Army on the border with Mexico. And indeed, the president is in the process of federalizing the National Guard to reinforce the regular forces with an additional 150,000 National Guardsmen on the border. Now, if that has a contemporary ring to it, let me tell you, that actually comes from pieces of it are excerpted from the 1915 reports on the Mexican border. We indeed did have half the mobile forces of the U.S. Army and considerable, almost the entire National Guard at that time, deployed on the southern border. And it was really in response to the chaos that accompanied the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1920. Now, as I say, it's an interesting piece of history to look at, because what happened next in terms of our efforts to deal with the problem on the border resulted in further incursions in the United States. And then that escalated into the Pershing expedition, where US forces invaded Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa. One lesson here, as we learned, is if we use military force to go after the cartels, which is certainly an option, it can easily lead to an escalation, either to deter us from doing so or as a reprisal for US actions, into a genuine terrorist campaign, not only on the border, but within the United States, where certainly the cartels do have potential operatives for terrorist activity. So let me turn the page real quickly and go on to, John has mentioned that the idea of designating the cartels as terrorist organizations, foreign terrorist organizations, has come up before. It's an appealing idea to members of Congress. It's something you say after you pound the podium. Senator Lindsey Graham just a day or so ago said he wants to unleash the fury and might of the United States on Mexico's cartels. And he talked about authorizing the use of military force, an AUMF, just like we had in going after Afghanistan and going into Iraq, to destroy drug labs, but, quote, not asking the US Army to launch a military attack on Mexico. Not quite sure how we use military force to destroy drug labs, and that doesn't mean a military attack on Mexico.
Okay.
The problem is that declaring anything a terrorist organization, a designation it seems to some people to have magical powers, that if we only declare them a foreign terrorist organization, that will solve the problem. It'll certainly raise the profile of the issue. It will free up more resources. It will lead, it's an anteroom to the use of military force. It means taking the gloves off. The arguments against, some of them are very good, some of them are a bit weak. One of the arguments against as well, the drug cartels are not technically terrorists. I regard that as a kind of a weak statement, because it, in a sense, wraps the issue around our own bureaucratic definitions. Some fear that will lead to a parallel increased law enforcement effort in the United States, which inevitably will be focused on minority populations. It will anger Mexico. We will get no cooperation on the other side. The decapitation, as John mentioned, there's already, as some of these big cartels are breaking up, we see more violence. Decapitation could produce greater violence. You know, you want to think about that a bit, because if Mexico or anybody goes after the cartels and breaks up the big ones, we're going to have a lot more fighting among the little ones. It could clearly torpedo the Mexican economy, not just interrupt drug flows, but it means really an end to U.S. tourism. It means more Mexican refugees heading north. That it will put us in a forever war. That would be a real possibility. It'll distract us from the other issues, Ukraine, China, things of that sort. My problem is I think that the designation issue is a complete distraction. Stridency, which we see in the wake of these events, like the one in Matamoros, is not a strategy. And we really don't have a strategy to go along with it. What is it that we can really do with or without a designation? What do we want to do, and can we do it? And that's where the discussion should lie, not in some to me distracting debate about whether the cartels should be designated terrorist organizations or not. And I'll leave it there, John.
Great, Brian, thanks. That's a great overview of the issue. And I do hope we're going to be able to cover a lot of this today. I do hope we get the chance to take deeper dives in the future, because this isn't going away. Two things before I jump into clarifying on that. Hal mentioned the Sinaloa Cowboys. When I was a young deputy sheriff driving a radio car in South Central Los Angeles in the Linwood Watts area, we encountered what we then called Sinaloa Cowboys, Mexican gentlemen driving pickup trucks with Brahma Bull stickers on the side of the car, and they would invariably have pearl handle revolvers along with large quantities of narcotics. Quite frankly, we underestimated it, did not recognize what that was. That was a very, we're talking the late 1980s. It's the precursor of where cartels have gone now. Cartels are deeply interpenetrated with organized crime groups in the United States, including groups like the Mexican Mafia, outlaw motorcycle gangs, all the Crips and Bloods and People and Folk, MS-13 and others. They are complex components of the international illicit economy. Going back to the Gulf Cartel, the Cartel del Golfo originally started in the 1930s. It's the oldest extant Mexican cartel to my knowledge. They started in Matamoros during Prohibition. And like many others, they were engaged in, cross-border trafficking, smuggling, of alcohol. When prohibition ended, they moved into other crimes because criminal groups, there's a belief right now that if you legalize narcotics, that organized crime and what people call drug trafficking organizations, which I think is a really bad term because they're polycrime organizations, and they really make a lot of their money from extortion and kidnapping and other enterprises. So you're not going to magically wave the wand and get rid of, the organized crime because you've changed the legal foundation. In fact, in California, we legalized marijuana, and guess who's the largest producer of and regulator of that illicit economy, which intersects with the illicit economy. So there's a great economy. It's the cartels. We legalized it and they didn't go away. So that's a place where ideology gets in the way of empirical evidence. Now, in the 70s, under Juan Garcia Abrego, the Gulf cartel added cocaine and corrupting public officials, including U.S. law enforcement agencies and officers, and allegedly the Texas National Guard, into the mix. Garcia Abrego was followed by Ociel Cardena Guillen, who recruited the Zetas, Los Zetas, from the Mexican Army's Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, or the GAFE. That group became quite notable. They were originally enforcers and actually fused with the Gulf cartel into what they at that time called La Compañía. They split what I call kind of the Gulf Zeta split that occurred in roughly mid 2000s. Then Cardenas's brother, along with his brother Antonio Cardenas Guillen, along with Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sanchez, who they call El Cos, notably a former cop. There's lots of former cops in the Mexican drug trafficking business, by the way. In fact, what we call the Guadalajara cartel was run by a Mexican, what we would then call a federale, a Mexican federal law enforcement officer during the period of the PRI, or the Institutional Revolutionary Party. The Scorpions, or Los Escorpiones, also known as Grupo Escorpios, were a mercenary group that protected Antonio Cardenas Guillen. Now, the mercenary mix in what I call, when organized crime groups, cartels, or gangs reach this level of activity, I prefer to call them criminal armed groups, because they then perhaps shift the legal definition of where the conflict exists. The current Gulf cartel, CDG, is divided into factions. Los Scorpions, the ones we talk about, are a significant faction, but also Los Ciclones, or the Cyclones, Los Metros, Los Rojos, and another group called the Panteras, or Panthers. The group is not cohesive. And I think that's one of the difficulties when you deal with some of the international legal regimes. Should you term what's happening in Mexico a NIAC, or non-international armed conflict? And I think it raises to that level. The international legal regime looks for hierarchical organizations and does not necessarily understand networked organizations. So when we talk about, was this the Gulf cartel? Was it a subordinate gang? Who were they? It's a mix. It changes over time. And some of our strategies flatten that organization and make them difficult to combat. I have seen some noted Mexican scholars like Alejandro Hope, who is a noted columnist, formerly a senior official with CISEN, the Mexican intelligence, say that military action won't work against them because they're a network. That's a Mexican preference. They don't want American military intervention at all. But I believe the military can combat networks. It just has to understand how. And I know that the work has been done. David Ronfeldt and John Arquilla have both at RAND and Arquilla at Naval Postgraduate School have been looking at these issues for a quarter of a century. And they, in fact, have informed lots of the intelligence work that we have collectively on this panel been working on for years. Now, the cartel, the Golfo, or the Gulf cartel, has a presence in the US, as do most of the groups here. They specifically have a strong link in Texas, But even more important to that, because what adds to their complexity and resiliency, they have strong links via the Ndrangheta, which I personally think is the most sophisticated, powerful mafia currently extant, operates in Europe and Asia and Australia and the United States, South America. They have links there. Tamaulipas itself is known for rampant police and public corruption. In fact, over the past several years, actually since I started my doctoral studies, people would ask me, is Mexico a failed state? And my answer is no, not by most conventional definitions. It could become one, and there are ways that that could occur. But parts of Mexico, some of the subordinate states, and Mexico currently has 32 states. We used to talk about 31 in the federal district, but they're now configured as 32 states. Tamaulipas has long been viewed as a failed state, just like currently you'd say Guanajuato is a failed state, Michoacan, touch and go, Guerrero. But Tamaulipas has always been at the top of the hit parade as at least a fragile or weak state with many characteristics of failure. They have rampant police and public corruption. In fact, when we started looking at this, and Hal and I talked about this yesterday about the Scorpions, what were they like? Were they like the Zetas? Were they former military guys? And I'm like, well, I don't know their exact composition, but I do know that they seem to me to be a lot like La Línea, which is a group that operates in Chihuahua to the west of Tamaulipas. And in La Línea was a composite of the Barrio Azteca gang from El Paso, the Los Aztecas, their branch in Ciudad Juarez, as well as components of the Chihuahua State Police and some corrupted elements of the Mexican Army or Sedena. I think there are most likely corrupt cops in this mix. There's perhaps some individual military. It's not like the entire military units have moved over there. They're not as notorious as the Zetas with their link to the GAFE in the past, but that public corruption is important. In the last 20 years, the weakness of Tamaulipas has been notorious. There's been accusations of corruption going as high as the governor of the state and several successive governors of the state and their brothers, because organized crime is often a family business. What do? They do drug trafficking, but they're also involved in protection rackets, extortion. I think that is significant. They're involved in human trafficking, extorting human traffickers and doing some of their own trafficking. Kidnappings are and have been and will remain lucrative. One of their big business lines is what they call huachicaleo, or oil theft from Pemex. They do illicit taps on the Pemex pipelines and divert the process. And there have been court cases where they move the condensate up into Texas and have sell it there and link with American or North American U.S. groups. Money laundering. And money laundering is the biggest cross-border threat. The threat of cross-border violence exists, but it's very low level, and there are reasons why. Because although in that Rio Grande Valley part of Texas, there's a real significant issue with public corruption, to include public corruption among members of the Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol, and into the what they call the judge. They have county judges that are actually like the Board of Supervisors. There have been issues related there and corruption among the cops. So that's the CDG. Now the hyperborder, the area they lie in, I call it the hyperborder. That term comes from a Mexican architect who's actually, the name was Romero, the son-in-law of Carlos Slim, who's I guess one of the most rich, one of the wealthiest persons in Mexico, certainly. And that's because of the intense economic and social and cultural interconnectivity within the border zone. I don't know the exact number, but my impression from looking at the economic statistics over the past 15 years or so is that perhaps up to a third of the economic power of US and Mexico individually occurs in that border zone. And think of that. If you look at what are the border zones, there are key states on the US border: California, obviously a huge economic engine of its own. Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, another important economic, warehouse. In Mexico, you have Baja California, so you have Tijuana, Ensenada. By the way, Ensenada has been engaged in the drug trade with fentanyl, not fentanyl because it didn't exist, but with the Chinese organized crime groups going back to the 19th century.
Yep.
So it's like, it's not a surprise that there's a Mexican organized crime, Chinese organized crime nexus. It goes back, over 100 years. Sonora, Chihuahua, obviously Ciudad Juarez is important. It's a key city. Nuevo León is where Monterrey exists. Monterrey is the industrial city of Mexico.
Yep.
It's the economic engine. Mexico City is a cultural center. Monterrey is the economic engine. And obviously Tamaulipas is important because it's on the coast. The U.S.-Mexican border economy is tightly coupled. Bilateral trade tops $1 billion each day, and over 20% of U.S. jobs are linked to cross-border trade. And I mentioned the engine. Now, where does this come together with the conflict? I have termed it criminal insurgency. And that's not because the cartels are attempting to take over the state directly. They're trying to co-opt the state so they have freedom of movement. The equilibrium between the state and organized crime is broken and has been broken since roughly 2005, when the precursors to the current Mexican drug war existed, when Vicente Fox was president. Fox started some low-level intervention, and yes, they were militarized interventions because they were bringing together the Mexican military, Sedena and Semar, their naval forces, to back up the state police that were outgunned, is the simplest way. They didn't have the capacity, or they were too corrupt. When Calderon comes into power, he brings Mexican forces, in state forces, both federal police at that time and the military, largely Semar, but also Sedena, into Michoacan to combat the cartels, because at that time, he said, the cartels had overrun the capacity of the state to manage it. He subsequently, as does every Mexican president, denied that the cartels have outgunned the state and that the state doesn't have capacity. They will argue both sides depending upon what political objective they need to solve at the time. And that's not surprising, because we know crime stats and everything else can be manipulated from time to time. But when the equilibrium was broken, think of it. Criminal organizations have three options when dealing with states. They can evade the state, and that's their preference. They can corrupt the state, and they get really good at that. And they obviously have done so in parts of Mexico and obviously parts of the United States, or they can directly confront the state. In Mexico, the cartels are at the level where they are directly confronting the state. And this type of concept was originally articulated by John Bailey and Matthew Taylor, who were looking at Brazil and Mexico, which interestingly are my two major focuses of interest. Now, for me, what's occurring is a criminal insurgency. There are four types in my typology. Local insurgency, where the criminal groups or gangs, cartels and their subordinate elements battle for who controls the local turf. They can move on to the battle for the parallel state. That's when, say, for example, the two big cartel battling in Mexico right now are the Sinaloa Federation and the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or the CJNG. CJNG is the kind of a fragment of the Sinaloa Federation. They've filled the hyper-violent role that perhaps was once filled by the Zetas. Criminal groups adapt. The next thing, they could combat the state. That is one of the pieces that becomes important in what we're seeing now. The final case, which is what we see in places like Haiti, is the state implodes and they don't have the ability to do it. Couple of things before I pass this back on for both Hal and Brian to comment on this, is there are key elements to what's happening in criminal insurgency: insecurity, legitimacy, corruption, and impunity. When you look at all those, the violence is not the most important issue. It's part of the lack of security, insecurity, but what drives the threat to the state is actually the corruption, the impunity when you don't punish the corruption, which erodes legitimacy, the perception of legitimacy by the populace. So I would term that as a lack of capacity plus the lack of security leads to insolvency among the state. Before we jump onto the rest, Brian, did you want to comment on what I had just mentioned?
Yeah, let me just quickly underscore a couple of your comments and the following. I think that impressive description of in a sense the order of battle, if you will, if you can apply that to very complex criminal organizations that you gave was tremendous. But I think again, it just underscores the complexity of what we're dealing with. And on the one hand, I agree with you that military force can address complexity, it can address networks, but it's extremely difficult. I mean, the kind of complexity you're talking about in Mexico among the cartels and the gangs and so on, these relationships, this is not something that is solved with a missile strike or a drone strike or so on. And it is that's part one. The other thing I would like to underscore, and you touched upon this in several fashions, is how deeply embedded historically, economically, socially, how deeply embedded this is in Mexican society. When we talk about this, we're not talking about an adversary's army that we can put up on a wiring diagram. We're not talking about an entity that is separated from society, but rather is so pervasive within that society that we're talking about a subculture, we're talking about a civilization. I mean, you do not root out the criminal enterprises out of Mexico without fundamentally transforming the society of Mexico itself. I don't mean to make that sound like some sort of an accusation that all of Mexico is corrupt and involved in crime. I am simply saying that the organizations have been so successful in state capture through suborning individuals, through corruption. They are so pervasive in terms of the economy, in terms of employing people in illicit and licit businesses.
Yes.
That they are so deeply embedded psychologically in a sense that, you know, the pro drug kingpin corridas, the songs and everything.
Yes.
This is part of the popular culture. So when we talk about this, I mean, yes, we can imagine military force maybe addressing one narrow slice of this.
True.
But unless we're going to become an imperial power and take on a mission of 100 years here, military might, the might and fury that Senator Graham talks about ain't going to get us there.
Well, Brian, I agree, and I would not be a proponent of that. I would respond by a couple things. If you look at Charles Tilley's work on state transformation, state formation, and state formation and transformation. That's what's occurring in Mexico. The nature of the society is changing. The nature of sovereignty is changing. What the ultimate state will look like is changing. To deal with that, it is complex. It is not a military solution. It's a whole of government, a whole of society solution. There are problems with designating them as terrorists. I mean, one, and you hit it on earlier, in the 19th century, we didn't call people terrorists, we called them anarchists. Whenever somebody had a political view and used violence or not, or protest, they were termed as anarchists. We've not gotten to the point where everybody wants to call somebody they disagree with, who may be involved in protest and some kind of very low levels of violence, terrorists. That's hard because not everybody engaged in protest or resistance against the government is a terrorist. The problem I see is terming these groups in Mexico terrorists and calling for US intervention is one, it's questionable under international law whether we could go, because you'd be non-international armed groups within the country are the responsibility of the state. Mexican government has a responsibility to solve that. If we go in without their invitation or authorization from the UN Security Council, that's a belligerent act.
Mhm.
You know, and there are ways you can get around that, but you know, it's kind of hard to say that the flow of fentanyl into the United States is a dangerous act that requires us to take protective preemptive measures when drugs have been coming from Mexico to the United States since the 19th century. Pancho Villa funded the revolution with the marijuana trade, and we haven't done so yet. It's not an exigent state. So that definition is hard. Conflict designation on non-international armed conflict is hard because you need to have intensity and organizational capacity to do that. They can be, criminal groups can be viewed as combatants because, you know, under the International Criminal Tribunal when the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, in a decision known as Lamage, prosecutor versus Lamage, the court came down and said, yes, indeed, criminal armed groups can be combatants. They can be subject to international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict. So those issues are there. We don't need to designate them as terrorists because right now the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has the ability to designate a group as a transnational criminal organization, which is what they are, and gives you all the capability other than the authorization for use of force, which I don't think exists independently on, you know, designating a group as terrorists. And that's codified at, you know, 31 Code of Federal Regulations 590. So I'd like perhaps suggest we look at that. But Hal, weigh in on this from your border intelligence HIDA point of view.
Well, part of it, and I've got to touch on a couple of things. I just want to say targeting is a big issue, and it gets into the details. It gets into everything else we talked about, sovereignty, things like that. But that's a really tough one. Jurisdiction is another one. Who's going to take lead on this? You know, and Brian can tell you, and so can you. If you change the designation from being a criminal organization, a drug trafficking organization, to being a terrorist organization within the U.S., from a legal standpoint, law enforcement standpoint, that changes who's in charge and in charge of what. That's a big definition. All right. And then I'm keeping the military side out of this so far. One thing to understand is we've been at the war on drugs for 40 some years, you know, 45 or 40 years about. All right. And we've won, so we're good. No, we're probably in worse shape today than we were when we started in many ways. The drugs have changed. You know, today it's fentanyl. Back in the early 80s, the big focus was on crack cocaine or cocaine in general. When I worked drug stuff, it was mostly working cocaine issues, but we also had marijuana cases. We had a variety of different things. Methamphetamines was coming on big then. And so the drugs, they do change, but there are certain consistencies in the type of organizations in terms of how they move, how they operate. The violence may increase, but at the end of the day, these are criminal enterprises and they are business organizations. They're there to make money. As we used to say with high intensity drug trafficking, look, they may be very violent as individuals. They may be very strong willed, but generally speaking, drug trafficking is not a crime of passion. It's a crime of profit is what it is. And that's the big focus. Now, one of the problems we've had, and this gets into what they're we have to work through this stuff. Who do we go after? What do we target? Historically, we've been very divided in how we do this. You know, way back when we said we need an intelligence center for the southwest border, we put it in El Paso, and then after a lot of focus groups came up with the incredibly brilliant, insightful name, the El Paso Intelligence Center. I don't know where they got that. I just thought that was one of the great innovations of all time.
It was epic.
That was working pretty good. And then there was an East Coast senator, which will remain nameless, who said, well, wait a minute, there's a lot of drug money going on out there, stuff for intelligence. So in rural Pennsylvania, we stood up a thing called the National Drug Intelligence Center. And so the question is, which one was the National Drug Intelligence Center? And the answer is yes. And that existed for many years. Now, the National Drug Intelligence Center has diminished, kind of gone away, El Paso, but it took a long time to get there. But that divided effort continued because DEA was building up its intelligence program. So they were doing their intelligence program almost, if not separate, but they were doing parallel. They were doing their own investigations. They would hold on to money. There wasn't one central intelligence piece. And depending on what intelligence you're working with, depending on which organization you're with. And then the FBI weighed in the late 90s. They got into the war on drugs, which had a few of us scratching our heads saying, well, wait, I thought that's what the DEA was there for. In fact, I looked at their name. There's drug in there somewhere. And they said, no, we're going to get involved with it. So everybody was chasing this thing. And I'm not saying it was, you know, a paparazzi effect, but it was the hot topic and everybody was chasing it. But you get into some very basic things on the border. Who runs the intelligence piece? Who defines what the intel piece is on the border? Right now, there's a bunch of different intelligence nodes along the border. Some are multi-jurisdictional, like the HIDAs, the law enforcement coordination centers. Some work more investigative stuff. Some work things that are dealing with more operational stuff. Customs and Border Protection has really upped its game with intelligence on the border, working mostly operational type intelligence, but they have done that across the board. But you run into these things where you see, like in Texas, where you have the Texas, you know, the National Guard under state authority working the border. Okay, what nobody sees is what's the intelligence sharing piece behind that? How do you share intelligence behind that? How do you protect sources and methods if they are not working in a federal status? There's a lot of different things that happen, and sometimes it gets worked out and sometimes it doesn't get worked out. So before we do anything operationally against the cartels, we've got to figure out a unity of effort on the intelligence side just to figure out what we go after. Then the question is, what do you hit? You know, these drug labs aren't sitting out there in some rural field as a fentanyl production center in the same way that the methamphetamine labs weren't sitting out there. They were built into urban areas, into structures, into places that you can't hit them with a drone. You can't hit them with a missile. And if you did, you would be literally attacking a foreign country unless you did it in conjunction with them. And that's one of the problems that deals with sovereignty. This is not Afghanistan. This is not Iraq. This is a sovereign country. We have extensive, long-standing social, cultural, economic ties in Mexico. And you know, like the punitive campaign, it didn't really produce much. It went down there, they ran around. They did manage to wipe out all the aircraft because they used up all the hours on them, which actually helped with building more aircraft if you're in the defense industrial base. But with that, it didn't do anything. And actually, Pancho Villa ended up becoming the president of Mexico, the guy we're going after. So it was kind of counterproductive. So when you go back and you look at this, we got to work the financial side on this. And I would say looking at Ukraine and what we've done with sanctions against Russia and going after oligarchs might provide a roadmap to what might be done to go after the cartels. I've seen something happening here in the last year, which we kind of pushed back in the 90s, that got pushed back. But we have watched what's happened with going after the cartels, going after them as enterprises, going after them and shutting down their economic capability. That seems to have really borne some fruit and has some long-term stuff. And I would push that long before trying to do military, because it has to be done with the government. But then, as we saw a few years ago, General General Luna, they're like their version of Hoover. Well, it turns out he's working for the Sinaloan cartel. So it's a real
Garcia
problem.
Luna was corrupt. Now, Hal,
Yeah.
the question of military response, I'm going to close this and then go to some questions before I give the ultimate close. It depends on who's military. Now, in
Yes.
Mexico, because of the endemic corruption, the inefficient police system, the need for ongoing police reform, Andrés López, Manuel Obrador, the current president, opted to create the Guardia Nacional, which was originally going to be a civil agency, which he's now transitioning, despite some legal challenges, into being a militarized force, primarily militarized force. I myself believe that a gendarmerie type force has great utility in these types of events, like the Carabinieri and the French gendarmerie were very effective in the Balkans and, Kosovo and Sarajevo, and those conflicts filled a gap that we didn't have. And in a short term, the military can do internal policing issues. The problem with using the military as an instrument for internal security is, other than those specialty forces like the Gendarmerie and the Carabinieri, which have, and the Marechaussee in the Netherlands, and others like that have regular civil missions and have like a dual response and report to the Minister of the Interior. And in France, for example, they are actually fully vetted as within the judiciary to be able to work with the investigative magistrates. That's not the solution. You need a full spectrum of policing, from community policing, which barely exists in Mexico. We often talk about in Mexican police reform performing what they call the preventive police, or the visible uniform patrol, which tends to be like, was a federal police, which is now in the mission of the Guardia Nacional. And they never talk about the judicial police that do the investigations. And my question is, why is that not spoken of? And that's beyond what we can answer here, but that's the place. You don't attack transnational criminal enterprises with global connectivity through preventive patrol with light infantry capable police. There is a time and place for that. You combat those organizations because they're big enterprises, or money laundering and human trafficking and all those things. You combat those with sophisticated investigations. And that piece is missed out. And that's not a piece. The US military does not have a expeditionary policing capability. And that doesn't mean we don't have military police, but their functions in combat tend to be different. And I've often thought a gendarmerie may come together. Now, Bob, how did you want to handle the questions?
I want to handle one by taking the prerogative to ask one myself, but there's some other really good questions in chat, and I can help direct those to you too. For both Colin Agee and Junaid Islam, I would like to promote you up to so you can speak yourself. Johnny Sawyer too has a good question he's typed in, and Matthew Shoemaker. So I'll help bring those questions up to you, but I want to ask one myself first.
Okay.
I want to know what advice the three of you have to corporate America. And the way maybe it would be easier to ask this is to say, for the member of a board of directors for a corporation who has extensive ties to Mexico, what would you advise them to do? Of course, I mean, Mexico is so tightly integrated into most supply chains, including some very high-tech supply chains, aerospace, space, automobiles, microelectronics. If you are on the board of directors of a U.S. corporation with a supply chain integrated into Mexico, what should they do about all this? And I wanted to say, there's some easy answers that I know. The easy answer: stay informed, track this closely, track your people, keep your people informed, keep your people trained. But there must be something else besides these easy, basic things. And that's what I would really like to ask you guys your thoughts on. And as you're talking about that, I want to promote up Junaid and Colin and Johnny to get them to prepare some questions.
While you do that, if I may, I throw that question to Brian, just because Brian's deep experience with counter kidnapping, which I know included practice in Mexico and his role honchoing several corporate security entities over the year. And then after Brian hits that, I might hit it to Hal briefly, because Hal does competitive business intelligence too. Brian?
Well, look, what's fascinating is that because of, what the pandemic, what the war in Ukraine, what our challenges from China are underscoring in general in the world is that risk is back. The world is a dangerous place. And so a lot of corporations now that, in a sense, in investment and trade and global manufacturing had a relatively wide open period in which they could do this. And certainly there were kidnappings, there were terrorist crises and so on. But these were relatively modest problems. As a consequence of some of these bigger issues we're facing right now, there is a tendency toward reshoring or a little bit of deglobalization. But ironically, part of that deglobalization is we get out of places like China and some of the more exposed places, and we bring them closer to home, Mexico.
Yep.
So now what we're talking about today kind of runs contrary to that. We're saying this is a very dangerous place. Despite the drug trafficking, despite the kidnapping threats, which in Mexico were never as bad as they were in Colombia, and people did. Capitalism is tough, and if you can make a buck someplace, there'll be some tough entrepreneurs that will figure out how to do it, and they'll take the risk. But the real issue, I think, is to assess whether, in the circumstances involved that we see in Mexico, how much really is that affecting the cross-border trade with the manufacturing being done in Mexico up to the United States? It is interesting where you have, and I think, John, you gave some interesting figures there in terms of how many, it's $1 billion a day and going across the border, how commerce can coexist with high levels of violence. And so the one piece of advice I would not give now is that, well, we have to pull everything out of Mexico. That one, it's not going to occur, and it doesn't need to occur. But in the long term, it does become part of the political risk equation that we're looking at in that area. Secondly, if that trade is valuable to us, valuable to the United States, which it clearly is, valuable to American corporations, the first advice that you always start with under the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. And so as we think about some of these more ambitious unleashing hell and fury on Mexico, the question is, what consequences could that have in terms of economic relationships other than drugs that are really, truly valuable to us? So be careful that we don't take something and make it into a real problem for the American economy and corporations.
Right.
Brian, you're absolutely on target. Hal, just real quick.
I was going to say, I've been doing this over the last few years, and working with, we actually looked at setting up a big, I was consulting on setting a big maquiladora type industrial plant, chemical plant down in the Monterey area. That was one of the areas we're looking at. And we were going to be taking in some stuff from overseas. We're looking at where we're going to bring it in, which ports, which rail lines, what we're going to need. And at the end of the day, we create something that looks like a big white powdery bag that goes north to North America. And of course, part of the discussion was, what would someone nefarious want to hide in a big bag of caustic substances that's white and powdery going to North America? And that was part of our discussion. But what it gets into is what Brian just talked about, is the risk. And it's a comprehensive risk assessment across the board that has to be based on a very thorough threat assessment. And it's a threat assessment that's a little bit different than how we do it. It has to look at all facets of the supply chain, or as they say in business, the value chain, everywhere that you're working, to look at vulnerabilities. And we're looking at some vulnerabilities which are a little bit different because of the criminal environment that we're dealing with. But looking where whatever we're doing can be compromised, and then honestly dealing with some of the threats we face, such as extortion, ransom. This is the cost of doing business, and that needs to be plugged in. And one thing I will say is, when and I was doing an international management program at a school called Thunderbird back in the early 90s, and right there on Mexico, right there next to Mexico. And the NAFTA agreement was big. We're gonna have free trade in North America, it'll be fantastic. And of course, Mexico's waiting with this big catcher's mitt saying, fantastic, we're gonna get a ton of manufacturing. They got some, but a lot of that went south and then took a hard right turn and shot out across the Pacific and went to China. That's coming back. Fortress North America is a real thing. China has made itself bad for foreign investment. Russia is no longer even in the foreign investment side. And a lot of that manufacturing, a lot of the things that were being done are coming back to North America. Mexico is sitting in a prime seat. It could transform Mexico's economy in ways that kind of remind me of what happened with, say, South Korea going back many, many years. I could see that happening in a much more comprehensive way. But with that, there has to be a very mature conversation with the government across the board to say, look, we have to address these risks.
Hal,
If you
you're
want
right.
manufacturing, we have to get into that.
Can you pass it on to Bob so we can queue up the next question for us?
Right.
Absolutely.
So, Junaid, we've promoted you up to panelist. Can you ask your question here? And then
Great.
Colin will follow.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a great discussion. I actually worked in Bogota in Peru 35 years ago, so I'm very aware of the violence and experienced it. But my question is something actually a lot closer to home, to something John and Brian have talked about, which is corruption in society. My wife is the school teacher right here, and one of her students actually is from the same town as El Chapo. So she asked him, what's he like? The kid actually knew him and said, he is a wonderful person in the most sincere sense. He helped his family, the parents. He helped other poor people in the town that he's at. As he helped people, he never pushed them into drugs or enslaved them. I mean, if people wanted a job with him, they got it, but they were on their own. And the reason I bring this up is, we've talked about fighting the cartel from a law enforcement perspective or counterterror perspective, but as Brian and John have mentioned, they live in a society. But I think it's a mistake to say Mexican society or Colombian society is corrupt. The fact is, a lot of people are poor, and people in power don't care about them. People in business don't care about them. This is very similar to what happened in Afghanistan, where, yeah, there were a few Taliban that were terrorists, but a lot of them were just really poor farmers. And my concern is that unless we take a comprehensive look at the society that is so poor, that it's easy for the cartel to buy their way in because nobody else is helping them. The society ends up being a force multiplier for their actions.
No,
And I just would like your thoughts on both.
You're absolutely right. And there's a couple things. I've actually written a couple things. One, a specific paper at OODA on cross-border corruption and potentials and how cartels adapt and they can move forward. And that's beyond the scope of what we can get in today. But on the relationship between the cartels being able to provide social goods, And I'll tell you, the Zetas were the most violent cartel in Mexico, and they provided hurricane aid, humanitarian aid after hurricanes. People would say they were nothing but violent. They need to be viewed as legitimate. They need the consent of the populace to be able to operate, right? The Sinaloa cartel, during COVID, the Sinaloa cartel was providing aid packages, and they put Chapo's photo on the packages of aid they were putting out because they wanted to manipulate the public perception so they'd have freedom of operations. The best works on doing this. I mean, I've written about cartels and social banditry and narcocultura and corridos and how they move together, and how they shape the space to support the cartels. But what I would look back to is Eric Hobsbawm. He was a 20th century theorist. He wrote a couple pieces, Primitive Rebels, and another called Social Bandits. And you can buy the books. They're older, they're free, but you actually read the essay versions he did at the
I guess though, since we're in so much alignment, my question to you and Brian, since you're experts, is what should we do to get to the poor people in Mexico so they see us as a friend, a long-term sincere friend, and will help us on investigations, and don't see us as the enemy of the person who's helping them? I mean, do you have any suggestions of what to do? I mean, how do we reach these farmers and tell them?
The farmers don't, I mean, I would argue, having done field work down there, that they all know American culture. They all love Americans. They like their own culture. What we need to do is speak to the political elites of all four major parties. And the first thing I do is say, and then I'll let Brian respond, is we don't build the trust of the Mexican political elite by saying we want to bring punitive expeditions to Mexico. Because first of all, Mexico, organized crime, there are failed pockets. There are places, the entirety of Mexico is not failed. There are places, look, I worked patrol in Compton. I felt safer walking the streets of Mexico City, right? Unarmed, I'm sure there are neighborhoods there. I know there are neighborhoods there that are as risky. I went there with the cops. But we need to, one, I think, have a dialogue with the Mexican state, Mexican security entities. And really, this is a hemispheric issue. This is something that the entire Western Hemisphere is dealing with. Because I'll tell you what, we talk about closing off the border from fentanyl in Mexico. Well, the Chinese organized crime guys flow large parts of their trade through Vancouver, right? And I don't see anybody calling us to go do punitive expeditions in Canada. But we have to, diplomacy is a wonderful tool. Just like, there was once an ambassador at large for counterterrorism. I mean, perhaps we need an ambassador at large for transnational organized crime. And I'm sure there's somebody who fills that role, but I suspect they need to be emboldened. But we need to work with multilateral entities. We need to work with the Organization of American States. We need to work with the Inter-American Human Rights Court and others. But Brian, you've been doing this for a long time. What do you think?
I'm going to take a somewhat contrary point of view on this. Just realistically, the idea of persuading the Congress of the United States or even the American people that we should be providing more economic assistance to Mexican farmers is not something which is going to gain a lot of traction in Washington right now. Just the mood of the country, the economic state of our own country is not something which is going to get you very far down that path. It is far more likely, given the mood of the country, that and this depends on a lot of other factors, that we lurch back into a kind of extreme isolationism, where it's not just building a wall on the southern border, it is really building a psychological wall around the entire country in terms of our willingness to be involved in foreign matters. One thing that would be a useful ingredient is, and this is where it becomes contrary, is, because of developments of the economy, because of automation, because of globalization, we have and continue to lose jobs in this country that were once filled by young men with only high school educations. And yes, we'd like everybody to get a PhD in some utopian future, but in the meantime, we really have hollowed out our society in the Midwest and in the Rust Belt and so on. That is fueling high rates of suicide, of violence in our own society, and including drug addiction. You know, and one component of dealing with the drug thing has to always be, what can we do in our society to reduce demand? And if the United States Congress can be persuaded, despite now all of the posturing over the national debt, to free up some development money, you may have a good chance of saying, look, we have some needy left behind portions of the United States itself and populations of the United States, and we could save some lives from people killing themselves with drugs, drink, or other factors by putting it there, and that will at least have a knock-on effect to perhaps reducing somewhat the drug consumption in our own country.
If I could say two words, asset forfeiture. It got a bad name, policing for profit. These are criminal enterprises. If you can find a way and provide the judicial framework where you can expropriate the wealth of the criminal organizations and then transfer that wealth somewhere else, the local governments, whatever, and provide benefit to the people, then you're going to build that base of support. And that's what we tried to push. It didn't go very far. I know we got the field intelligence centers around the world. We got the Egmont Group, all this stuff, but that's why I kind of point to what's happened with the oligarchs, Ukraine. That is the most comprehensive global system I have ever seen, where we have gone after the wealth of another country and looking at using it for things like rebuilding Ukraine after the war. If we took that same sort of focus and used that with the drug cartels and working with the host nation judiciaries, the host nation governments in an international legal framework, I think that might be a way that we could actually do something. And I kind of
like that, Hal. I like that a lot. And I just wanted to interrupt and say we're going to need to speed things up just a little bit here and get to Colin.
Yeah.
Colin, are you still with us?
Bob, I hate to say this. I got to go. I got a television network interview here, so I got to take off. So
all right. Thanks, Hal.
Hal, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you later.
They wanted a top expert and they couldn't find one, so they called me instead. So yeah. All right.
Thanks.
Great.
All right. I'll see you. Thanks.
Thanks, Hal.
Thanks, John.
Colin, good seeing you tonight.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Everything in our country seems to be politicized. And so the question I want to ask about is the wall, because if you listen to one side, it's a panacea for, immigration, drugs, crime. And if you listen to the other side, it's totally worthless and we won't spend a penny. So, as folks who are actually in this fight, what do you think the efficacy of a wall is?
I'll jump in first, and I think walls have a place, but they are not the panacea. They do not solve everything. There are places that we're putting walls that, quite frankly, and I've walked the border, I've been there, that they aren't trafficking drugs across. You can't move vehicles across some of that area they're doing. You can't even effectively move people without killing them in the process. So in some ways, the wall has become emblematic of, we want to stop the crime. And part of it is, I think Brian hit it. We want Fortress America. We want to be isolationist again. Walls can be defeated. Walls, the wall that they've been putting up, parts of it are falling down. They're not effective by themselves. There are places where absolutely you should have a wall. And there are other types of sensor technology that'll be there. It's not the solution. It's part of a suite of solutions. And I will couple that on just to respond back to what Hal said. Doing financial asset forfeitures is great. There are certain legal due process issues that we didn't do well in this country and still don't. In a place like Mexico, they're hard because you have the interpenetration of corruption, the co-opted state reconfiguration where organized crime has penetrated the government. When you steal money from the political elites that are linked to the cartels, they won't let it happen. Well, you could do some of that with financial crimes investigations, FinCEN, and work on trade-based money laundering here in the United States on our side. And the problem is there aren't enough federal cops to do that. And I'm guaranteed after spending 3 decades trying to build an intelligence capacity to do those type of things for counterterrorism in Los Angeles, there are very few local cops who have any clue what I just said.
I have one other thing to think about, Colin, and that is there are places like in the Chihuahua Desert where you can't build a wall unless first you build a road. So you're going to have to establish this massive road network. Then you build a wall that can be penetrated, and you've given a road. So you're going to accelerate the movement of drugs further into the country. So that's something I don't think people think enough about, is you would have to build a road infrastructure to build the walls in some places.
Yeah, and most of the product that we're talking about moves through the border stations anyway. They just overload what we have. So we need to be more effective. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll let Brian jump, take one more question and maybe give the close, is that we would need to be very careful. The 20% of all jobs in the United States are tied to the cross-border traffic with Mexico. So if we want to put a chill on 20% of our earning capacity, over building a fortress on the border and slowing things down is going to put a hurt on that $1 billion a day traffic, across the border. We're going to hurt our own border. There are better ways to build cohesive solutions. But Brian?
Well, look, walls work as barriers, but the fact is that we cannot have a barrier between a complete hermetically sealed barrier between ourselves and Mexico for the very point that you raised. Our economy depends on it. Their economy depends to a great deal on it, and it's not in our own national security interest to tank their economy. But let me quickly turn the page and come back to this issue of transfer of wealth, confiscations, things of that sort, which you're right, John, in pointing out that there are people in the elites that make money on that. We probably could do more with intelligence and turning that into an information war. I mean, it would really be, I think, now my working class backgrounds are going to show up here, but exposing some of the corruption, I mean, in detail, sharing intelligence, not just with the Mexican government, but publicizing it in a variety of ways that get to the people, that show that the amounts of money some of these corrupt officials are making on this, and that when we go after some of these things, if there's a mechanism for transferring that, and we can even potentially, I mean, if we can confiscate resources because of criminal activity in U.S., confiscate resources belonging to Mexican individuals, we can set up our own fund, aid fund, to say that goes into an aid fund, and that will go directly back to assistance to ordinary people, villages, and so on. So we can be the mechanism for that and fund it with money that's frozen or seized.
And much more effective than punitive expeditions.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we have a lot more questions here, and I don't think we're going to be able to get to any of them, unfortunately. We may need to try to reconvene the group to continue the discussion another day.
Bob, I would welcome that, because we're really scratching the surface. I mean, I've been spending 15 years every day reading 5 Mexican newspapers in Spanish and talking daily to people down there. There's so much to do. I am to close this up. I am absolutely honored to have chaired this panel. It's always wonderful interacting with Brian. I always, for the last 30 years or more, I've always learned more every time we talk. I enjoy working with Hal. Hal was one of my go-to guys on how to figure out how to do civil military affairs. I love working with the OODA group. The questions from the audience were on target. I think I'll close this by saying bilateral cooperation with this issue is absolutely essential. We need to build and sustain the rule of law. We need to counter corruption on our side too. We need to work on impunity. Now, one thing I will say, there's a growing effort within the United Nations on building an international counter-corruption body of law, international corruption law, being supported by groups like Transparency International and others. Those could become effective. For Mexico, they need to build a civil police capacity at all levels, municipal, state, and federal, and they need to find a way to integrate the preventive and investigative police, which can be done effective. The French have, the Italians have. They haven't quite got there yet. And the last thing, and I know Brian said it, you've said it, Hal said it, and I'll say it again, we need intelligence, and we need to figure out how to get that to the right place at the right time without exacerbating this conflict. So it's been a pleasure sharing this, and let me know if you need probably a few weeks to do the after action on this and, boil it down, but we should definitely come back and talk about these Mexican, US, or, Western Hemisphere security issues.
Right. Thanks, John. Thanks, Brian. Really appreciate both you guys and Hal too. This was fantastic.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.